The Great Hall was a cavern of shadows and shifting light, a space that had always felt too large for the modest pack that called it home. The air, thick with the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat, did little to mask the deeper, more primal scent of aggression that clung to the two men who dominated its center. Elara stood slightly behind her uncle, the Alpha of Sunrock, a place of quiet observance. She knew well, her role was to be present, to be silent, to be a decorative piece. In the political machinations of greater powers, she was a weaver by trade, her world one of threads and patterns, of stories told through tapestry. But the story being written tonight was one of blood and territory, and she found her own thread being pulled into its grim design. On one side of the massive stone hearth sat Kael, Alpha of the Frostfang pack. He was a man carved from winter itself, his posture rigid, his hair the color of pale ash. His eyes, a piercing shade of ice blue, held no warmth, only a calculating chill as they scanned the room, assessing threats and weaknesses. He was the embodiment of his northern territory, all stark lines and unforgiving principle. Opposite him, a study in contrast, was Lorcan of the Stoneclaw pack. Where Kael was controlled stillness, Lorcan was simmering energy. He lounged in his chair with a predatory grace, one arm draped over its back. His dark hair was tied back, revealing a face marked by a brutal scar that ran from temple to jaw, a testament to a life of conflict. His eyes, deep and dark as fertile earth, glinted with a ferocity that was barely leashed. The firelight seemed to cling to him, highlighting the raw, untamed power that radiated from his every pore. Between them lay the ruin of years, a strip of forest rich with game, a sacred stone stolen generations ago, insults traded and never forgiven. Their war had bled the land dry, and now, like a sickness, it had spread to the borders of Sunrock, scorching its fields and leaving its people hungry and afraid. Her uncle, Alpha Aldrich, cleared his throat, the sound weary and thin against the palpable tension. "This cannot continue," he said, his voice echoing softly in the high beams. "We are all diminished by this feud. Our pups cry from hunger, and our lands bear the scars of your strife. It ends here, tonight." Kael's voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder, over frozen ground. "It ends when the Stoneclaws acknowledge their trespass and withdraw to their mountains. Permanently." Lorcan's fist hit the arm of his chair, the crack of wood echoing sharply. "It ends when you return what was stolen, you frost-hearted thief. We will not withdraw from land that is rightfully ours." Elara flinched at the violence in his tone, the raw hatred that vibrated in the air between them. This was the dance of LYCANS, a language of snarls and posturing she had observed her whole life. But tonight, the rhythm felt different. The weight in the room was heavier, more final. The only treaty strong enough to bind such enmity is a blood treaty, Kael stated, his glacial gaze shifting from Lorcan to settle, for the first time, directly on Elara. The intensity of it stole her breath. Not blood spilled, blood shared. Lorcan followed his gaze, his own dark eyes narrowing. A long, silent moment passed as the two alphas looked at her, and the true meaning of their words crashed down upon her. She was not looking at men anymore. She was looking at predators, and she was the solution to their hunt. "An alliance," Lorcan said, the word a gravelly concession, "sealed by a union." A union. The word echoed in the silence of her mind. They could not mean it. They could not be so archaic, so brutally pragmatic. Aldrich would not meet her eyes. He stared at a point on the wall between the two alphas, his face a mask of resigned sorrow. "Elara carries a rare lineage. Her bloodline is pure, tracing back to the first Lycan mothers. A child of her line, raised to understand both territories, would be a living bridge. It is the only way to ensure a peace that lasts beyond our lifetimes." She was not asked. She was presented. A prize, a solution, a living, breathing contract. Her value was not in her knowledge of histories, not in her skill with a loom, not in the quiet strength of her spirit. It was in her womb. It was in the potential of a child she had not chosen to conceive. Her future, her body, her very self, were being divided into neat, annual segments between two titans who saw her not as a woman, but as a vessel for their ambition. The agreement was forged over her head, the terms cold and clinical. A year with Frostfang, a year with Stoneclaw. The child would be born under a full moon, a true son or daughter of both bloodlines, heir to a united territory. As the two alphas rose, the formalities concluded, Elara felt the world narrow to a single, horrifying point. She was the rope in a tug of war, destined to be stretched taut between two immovable forces. She was used to make peace, and as she stood there, the silent, gilded center of their accord, she understood that the cage she had always lived in had just acquired two new, formidable locks. The journey north was a slow, silent descent into another world. The vibrant greens and earthy browns of sunrock and the Stoneclaw borders faded, replaced by a monochrome palette of grays and whites. The air grew thin and sharp, each breath a crisp knife in the lungs, carrying the clean, sterile scent of snow and pine. The Frostfang territory was not merely a place on a map. It was a state of being, a lesson in endurance, and its alpha was its finest exemplar. Kael's stronghold was not a warm hall of hearths and laughter, but a formidable fortress of dark stone and timber, built into the side of a mountain itself. It was efficient, imposing, and breathtakingly cold. Elara was given chambers that were more a testament to Frostfang wealth than comfort. Furs of great white bears lay upon a vast bed, and tapestries depicting epic hunts under-filled. Skies adorned the walls, but the stone floor seeped a perpetual chill, and the fire in the hearth seemed to fight a losing battle against the deep cold that was the soul of this place. Kael himself was as distant and enigmatic as his domain. He was a warden, meticulous and thorough. He provided for her every conceivable need with a cold, impersonal efficiency. The finest cuts of meat, the warmest pelts, a personal guard of his most stoic warriors. All were supplied without request. And without warmth. His interactions with her were a series of formal, stilted exchanges. He inquired after her health, her comfort, the functionality of her rooms. He spoke to her of pack hierarchy, of border patrol schedules, of the unyielding laws that governed life in the north. His ice-blue eyes would glance over her, assessing her physical state like a farmer might assess livestock vital to the farm's survival. She was his most valuable political asset, and he guarded her with a possessiveness that was entirely devoid of passion. Elara felt herself becoming a ghost in the glacial fortress. She was respected by the pack members, but it was a wary, distant respect born entirely of her purpose. They saw the future she carried in her blood, not the woman who walked their halls. She spent her days in a quiet isolation, watching the world from her window, a world of stark beauty and silent strength. She saw the disciplined loyalty of the Frostfang pack, their movements economical, their communication often a series of glances and slight nods. They were a part of the landscape, as enduring and unforgiving as the granite peaks that sheltered them. Determined not to let her spirit freeze in this beautiful wasteland, she requested a loom. When it arrived, she began to weave. She did not replicate their scenes of hunt and battle. Instead, she began to create a tapestry of the stories she remembered, the old histories of all Lycan, not just the Frostfang's singular narrative. She wove scenes of the first mothers, of great alliances, forgotten, of the shared mythology that predated their bitter divisions. Kael noticed. He would sometimes pause at her open doorway, watching her hands work the threads, his expression unreadable. He began to ask questions not about the patterns, but about the stories they represented. Their conversations remained formal, but a new dimension emerged. She spoke of Stoneclaw legends not as the tales of an enemy, but as cultural curiosities, historical artifacts. She explained the significance of the very sacred stone Lorcan fought for, framing it not as a spoil of war but as a key to understanding his pack's identity. A subtle shift occurred during a meeting with his senior beta. A dispute had arisen over hunting rights in a valley now shared with Stoneclaw under the truce. Kael's solutions were rigid, based on old Frostfang laws that would inevitably provoke Lorcan's people. Elara, who had been sitting silently with her weaving, spoke without looking up. The Stoneclaws do not measure hunting grounds by ridge lines as you do, she said, her voice soft but clear in the council room. They measure by watersheds. The valley is one watershed. Proposing to split it along the ridge would be seen by them as dividing a single entity. It would be an insult, not a compromise. Propose a shared seasonal rotation based on the migration of the elk herd. It is a logic both packs understand. The room fell silent. Kael turned his chilling gaze upon her. She met it, not with defiance, but with a simple, factual calm. He held her look for a long moment, and she saw it again, that crack in the ice she had glimpsed at their parting in Sunrock. It was not warmth, but the dawning of a profound, reluctant respect. He dismissed her suggestion to his beta without a word, but the next day, the proposal he sent to Lorcan was for a shared seasonal rotation. The day of her departure arrived with the first true thaw. The ice on the river cracked with sounds like thunder, and the air lost its most brutal edge. Kael himself escorted her to the Stoneclaw emissaries, who had come to collect their turn with the treaty bride. As she stood ready to leave, he did not offer a smile or a kind word. He simply looked at her, his ice-blue eyes holding hers, and gave a slow, solemn nod. It was the acknowledgement of one strategist to another. The farewell was not from a man to a woman he would miss, but from a general to an advisor who had proven unexpectedly, indispensably useful. As she rode away from the frozen north, she left behind the ghost she had been and took with her the first faint, chilling ember of his regard. The transition from Kael's world to Lorcan's was not a journey but a seismic shift. The sterile, crisp air of the northern crags was replaced by a thick, humid blanket heavy with the scent of damp earth, rich loam, and blooming night flowers. Where Frostfang was a study in monochrome silence, the Stoneclaw territory was a riot of color and sound. The stronghold was not a fortress of carved stone but a sprawling complex of wooden lodges and woven shelters built amongst and around ancient trees, their branches hung with glowing lanterns that fought back the deep, velvety darkness of the southern wilds. Lorcan was there to meet her party personally. He did not wait on a raised dais or in a formal hall. He leaned against the trunk of a great oak at the edge of a bustling clearing, arms crossed over his broad chest, watching her approach with a dark, unblinking intensity that felt entirely different from Kael's cold assessment. Kael had looked at her and seen a strategic advantage. Lorcan looked at her and saw a conquest, a mystery, a possession he was impatient to understand. His first words to her were not a greeting. "So, the Frostfang sends me his prized bird. I hope the cold did not freeze your song." His voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding deep within the earth, and his smile was a sharp, challenging thing. He was everything Kael was not. He was physically present, constantly near, his energy a tangible force that filled whatever space he occupied. His possessiveness was not the detached, political stewardship of Kael. It was hot, primal, and simmering with a volatile curiosity. He tested her constantly, his words, laced with subtle barbs, meant to provoke a reaction, to find the weakness in her serene composure, to rouse the fire he was certain must be banked within her. Elara, however, was no longer the quiet woman who had left Sunrock. Her year of isolation in the north had been a forge, tempering her spirit in silence and self-reliance. She met his intensity not with submission or fear, but with an unshakable calm resolve that seemed to baffle and fascinate him in equal measure. She did not rise to his taunts. Instead, she answered his provocations with quiet observations about his territory, his people, turning his own tests into opportunities for genuine inquiry. Their conversations were a constant, charged dance. He would challenge her with some brutal truth of pack law. She would respond with a historical precedent from an ancient text he had never read. He would boast of a Stoneclaw victory. She would gently correct the timeline, placing it in the wider context of a larger, forgotten conflict that involved 3 packs. He began to seek her out, not to test her, but to talk. He showed her his world with a rough, proud passion. The hidden hot springs that steamed under the starlit sky, the caves adorned with paintings from the first LYCANS, the fierce, chaotic, and deeply loyal chaos of his people who expressed every emotion with their whole hearts. One evening, sitting by one of those hot springs, he spoke of the scar that marked his face. It was not a boast. His voice grew quiet, the bravado melting away to reveal something raw and genuine beneath. He spoke of a betrayal, of a lost brother, of the fight that had nearly cost him his life and his pack. He spoke of the weight of pride, the constant need to project strength. In turn, under the cloak of that shared vulnerability, Elara spoke of her own life, not of the treaty, but of herself. She spoke of the solace she found in stories, of the quiet power of weaving narratives together, of her observations of the world that so often went unheard by alphas who only listened for the sounds of battle. The air between them changed. The magnetic pull she felt was no longer just a physical attraction to his raw power. It was an intellectual and emotional draw to the complex, wounded, and fiercely intelligent man beneath the warrior's exterior. The shadow of Kael and the cold north remained, a distant thought at the back of her mind. But here, in the humid, living darkness of the southern wilds, with Lorcan's dark eyes watching her with a look that had shifted from predatory interest to something akin to captivated. That shadow felt very far away indeed. He was no longer just the other alpha in the agreement. He was becoming Lorcan, and she was dangerously, undeniably becoming his. The piece was a delicate glass sphere, beautiful in its conception but terrifying in its fragility. It shattered not from within, not from the simmering tension between two alphas, but from an external blow. The rogue pack came with the sudden, violent fury of a summer storm. They were outcasts, maddened by hunger and bitterness, and they smelled the weakness they perceived in the newfound alliance between two ancient rivals. They targeted the Stoneclaw borders, aiming to gut the softer underbelly of the territory first. Chaos erupted in the heart of Lorcan's domain. The night, once alive with the sounds of insects and distant laughter, was torn by snarls, the clash of teeth on teeth, and the agonized cries of the wounded. Elara in her quarters felt the shift in the air before she heard the alarms. The primal fear of the pack vibrated through the very ground. Without conscious thought, her body moved. She was a healer before she was a pawn, and her purpose in that moment was clear. Gathering her herbs and bandages, she ignored the shouted orders of her guards to barricade herself inside and ran toward the sounds of pain. She found a scene of brutal pandemonium under the flickering lantern light. Warriors, both human and wolf form, fought against a frenzied, mangy tide of rogues. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood and the raw musk of aggression. She dropped to her knees beside a young warrior clutching a deep gash in his arm, her hands steady as she began to clean and bind the wound. Her world narrowed to the task, to the application of pressure, to the whispered words of reassurance. She was a point of calm in the raging storm. It was then that she saw him. Lorcan was a whirlwind of controlled fury, a dark avenger holding the line against two massive rogues. His movements were breathtakingly efficient, all power and lethal grace, but he was focused on the threat before him. He did not see the third, a grizzled beast with milky eyes, break from the tree line. It lunged, not with a roar, but with a silent, deadly intent, aiming for Lorcan's exposed back. A cold terror, sharper than any she had known in the north, lanced through Elara. It was not a fear for the treaty, or for the peace, or for her own safety. It was a pure, undiluted terror for the man, for Lorcan, for his life. The sound that tore from her throat was not a scream. It was a command. It was a note of absolute, undeniable authority that seemed to warp the very air around it. It was raw, power, ancient and maternal, the voice of a protector that brooked no disobedience. No. The rogue froze, its body mid-pounce, seized as if it had struck an invisible wall. Its milky eyes widened in shock and confusion. That single second of hesitation was all Lorcan needed. Sensing the shift, he dispatched his two opponents. With a final, brutal move and whirled, his eyes instantly finding the frozen threat. With a snarl that promised oblivion, he ended it. A sudden, ringing silence fell over that corner of the battlefield. The fighting had moved on, leaving behind the wounded and the dead. The only sounds were the ragged panting of Lorcan and the soft moans of the injured. All eyes, those of the surviving Stoneclaws, turned to her. Lorcan shifted back. His chest heaved, muscles coiled and slick with sweat and blood. He took a step toward her, then another. His gaze was locked on her face, and the look in his dark eyes was transformed. The possessiveness, the curiosity, the simmering attraction, it was all burned away in the forge of that moment, replaced by something far more profound. It was a look of stunned, ferocious awe. He looked at her as if seeing her for the very first time, not as a woman, or a prize, or a treaty bride, but as a force of nature, as an equal. When Kael and his Frostfang warriors arrived moments later, summoned by the alarm howls that had cut through the night, this was what they found. They did not find a cowering political asset. They found Lorcan, standing as her solemn guardian, his posture not just protective but reverent, watching over the woman who had just rewritten her own destiny with a single, world-shifting word. The balance of power, the very understanding of what she was. The return to the Frostfang territory was a journey into a familiar landscape that now felt utterly alien. The crisp northern air, once a sterile blanket, carried a new charge. The imposing silence of the mountains seemed to listen. Elara carried within her a profound and terrifying duality. There was the confirmed life of the child, the very purpose of the treaty, a secret that was both a validation of her sacrifice and a chain that bound her future irrevocably to two powerful men. And there was the other secret, the one that hummed in her veins like a dormant storm, the memory of a power that had cracked the night air and frozen a beast in its tracks. She was no longer just the weaver of Sunrock. She was a vessel of legacy and a wielder of an authority she did not yet understand. Kael was informed of her condition upon their arrival. His reaction was a masterpiece of controlled revelation. There was no shout of triumph, no open display of emotion. Yet, the change in him was immediate and profound. His meticulous care evolved into something nearing reverence. He was the architect of this peace, and the child was its living, breathing testament, the ultimate validation of his cold strategy. His ice-blue eyes would now often linger on her, not with calculation, but with a deep, solemn contemplation. He ensured her every comfort was not just met but anticipated. The finest furs, the most nourishing meals, the most vigilant guards. She was the sacred ground in which the future was sown, but Elara was fundamentally changed. The woman who had commanded a rogue with her voice could not simply return to the role of silent, decorative asset. The lessons learned in Lorcan's passionate, chaotic court had ignited a spark of assertiveness. She began to offer her counsel not when asked, but when she saw the need. She attended his meetings with his betas, sitting with her ever-present weaving. A picture of demure tradition that was utterly betrayed by the sharpness of her insights. When a dispute arose over the shared management of a river now open to both packs, Kael's solutions were, as ever, rigidly logical and based on Frostfang precedents. Elara, her hands never stilling on her loom, spoke into the thoughtful silence that followed his decree. Lorcan's people do not think in terms of quotas and measured hours, she said, her voice calm yet clear. They think in terms of respect and balance. To assign them a specific time slot to fish the river will feel like an insult, a permission granted by a superior. Propose a system of shared guardianship. Let a small contingent from each pack patrol the waters together, ensuring its health, and mediating any disputes on the spot. It is a partnership, not a division. It is a logic of mutual benefit, which he will understand. Kael turned his gaze upon her. The council members held their breath, expecting a rebuke for her interruption. But he simply watched her, and she saw the slow, deep thought continue within him. He was beginning to see the partner she could be, the mind that could complement his own, not just the womb that carried his heir. He dismissed the council without agreeing aloud, but the proposal he sent south was for a joint guardianship. Messages began to arrive from the south, carried by Stoneclaw runners. They were no longer the formal, terse updates on border security or resource management. They were from Lorcan. His script was bold and slashing, filled with a barely restrained energy. They inquired after her health with a possessiveness that was intensely personal. He sent strange, beautiful feathers he had found, descriptions of a waterfall that had swelled with the rains, a piece of amber with an ancient insect trapped inside. His words were those of a man yearning, of a protector who felt his charge was too far away. They were a stark, warm contrast to the silent, respectful cold of the north, and they created a quiet, persistent tug on her heart. Elara found herself living in a state of emotional suspension, stretched between two poles. To the north, a slow, glacial respect was growing, a bond of minds built on shared strategy and quiet understanding. To the south, a passionate, fiery connection smoldered, built on saved lives and raw, unfiltered emotion. She carried the future within her, a future that was meant to unite two territories, but she felt the weight of it dividing her own heart. The peace was holding, but the woman at its center was navigating a more complex and treacherous landscape than any the two alphas had ever known. The fragile peace, so carefully cultivated, proved to be a vine with poisonous roots. It was not the open challenge of Lorcan that threatened to tear it all down, but a betrayal festering in the very heart of the Frostfang stronghold. A faction of traditionalists, wolves who saw the world in stark black and white, viewed the hybrid heir growing within Elara not as a bridge to the future, but as an abomination that diluted their pure bloodline. They saw her not as a unifying force, but as a Stoneclaw viper nestled in their bosom, a spy whose gentle words and clever counsel were a subtle poison. Their hatred, cold and patient, began to weave a plot for more sinister than open war. The attempt was crafted with a cunning that spoke of intimate knowledge. It was not a frontal assault, but a calculated accident. A frayed strap on her saddle, meant to break during a steep descent. A subtle poison in her evening tea, one that mimicked a sudden illness. It was to look like misfortune, a tragic end to a fragile treaty bride, an event that would conveniently sever the unwanted alliance and allow the Frostfang pack to return to its isolated purity. Elara's survival was not due to Kael's protection, but to her own heightened instincts, senses sharpened by pregnancy, and the latent power that had awoken within her. She noticed the minute tear in the leather a moment before mounting. She detected the faint, wrong scent clinging to her herbal tea, a bitterness that did not belong. The attempts were subtle, but to her, they screamed. The realization was a cold dread that seeped deeper than any northern frost. The greatest threat to her life, and to the peace, was not from across the border, but from within the very walls that were meant to be her sanctuary. The final attempt was the most brazen, a shadow in her own chambers, a blade aimed not to maim, but to silence forever. Her own scream, a reflex of pure terror, was enough to startle the assassin for a critical second. The struggle was short and desperate, a silent, brutal dance in the dark. It was ended by the timely intervention of a young Frostfang guard, one of the few who viewed her not as a threat, but with the reverence Kael had begun to show. The would-be killer was subdued, but the damage was done. The truth was out, and it was uglier than anyone could have imagined. Kael's rage was a terrifying thing. It was not the hot, explosive fury of Lorcan, but something far more dangerous. It was an absolute, glacial fury. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees when the plot was laid bare before him. His face, usually so impassive, was a mask of cold, hard fury. He saw not just an attempt on the heir, but a fundamental challenge to his authority, a stain on his pack's honor, and a personal failure to protect what was his. In the icy silence that followed the confession, he was forced to confront the horrifying truth that his own people were the architects of the coming war. He came to her that night. The control was back, but it was brittle, stretched thin over a depth of emotion she had never seen in him. My motives were political, he confessed, his voice low and strained, the admission seeming to cost him dearly. You were the key to a lock, a means to an end. But now, he looked at her, and the ice in his eyes had melted into something raw and vulnerable. Now my feelings are entangled. This was not meant to happen. Word, however, travels faster than regret. The news flew south on panicked wings. Lorcan's response was everything Kael's was not. It was not cold calculation. It was an inferno. He did not send messages. He did not demand explanations. The news that Elara had been attacked, that his child had been threatened, within the walls of the Frostfang stronghold, ignited a conflagration of protective fury. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that Kael could not keep her safe. His answer was not politics. It was a declaration. He mobilized his entire pack. The Stoneclaw war horns echoed through the southern wilds, not in defense, but in preparation for an assault. He was coming north. He was coming to retrieve what was his, and he would tear down the glacial fortress stone by stone to do it. Elara stood at her window, watching the organized chaos of a pack preparing for war both within and without. The peace she had been used to create was in its death throes, and she was the catalyst. The two alphas were now poised to destroy each other, each believing he was acting for her sake. She understood then that she could no longer be a prize to be fought over. The time for passivity was over. The shadow of the assassin's blade had forged a resolve of iron within her. To save them all, to save the future, she would have to stop being the object of their conflict and become the architect of their salvation. The air in the great hall of Sunrock was once again thick with tension, but this time it was of a different breed. It was not the aggressive posturing of rival predators, but the brittle, anxious silence of a future hanging in the balance. Kael stood by the cold hearth, his posture rigid, the very image of glacial control, but his ice-blue eyes betrayed a turmoil she had never seen in them before. Lorcan paced like a caged wolf, his energy a storm contained by stone walls. Every glance he threw at her, burning with a protective fury barely held in check. And between them stood Elara. She was no longer standing slightly behind her uncle. She stood at the very center, the focal point upon which all their fates now turned. The attempt on her life had been the final, shattering blow to the old way of doing things. It had proven that the peace they had built was a fragile shell, and that she would forever be its most vulnerable target unless the foundation itself was remade. She looked at Kael, meeting his chilled gaze without flinching. "You once saw me as a strategic advantage," she began, her voice clear and steady, resonating in the silent hall. "A key to a lock, but a key can be stolen or broken. I will not be that." She then turned to Lorcan, whose pacing had ceased, his dark eyes fixed on her with fierce intensity. "And you saw me as a conquest, a prize to be won from a rival, but a prize can be taken or lost. I will not be that either." She took a deep breath, drawing upon the strength she had forged in the northern silence and the southern fire. "You both used me to make a peace between the LYCANS, but the peace you made was a transaction. It was built on the old rules of possession and rivalry. It almost killed me, and it would have destroyed everything you claimed to want." She stepped forward, her hands clasped before her. "The child I carry is not just an heir. It is a symbol of a possibility you have both been too blind to see. A future where strength is not measured by who holds sole possession, but by what we can build together." Kael's voice was low. "What are you proposing?" "I am proposing a new structure," Elara said, her words falling like stones into a still pond. "This child will be raised as the heir to a single united territory, a new nation born of Frostfang and Stoneclaw together. They will learn the discipline of the North and the passion of the South. They will not be asked to choose a side, for there will be no sides, only one pack." Lorcan took a step toward her, his expression a mixture of awe and confusion. "And you?" "I will not be a possession to be rotated. I will not spend a year here and a year there, a perpetual hostage to your old feud." She looked between them, her gaze unwavering. "I will be the cornerstone. I will be the permanent center. I will reside in a neutral ground, and you will both come to me. We will rule this new pact together. My voice, the voice that halted a rogue's heart, will have equal weight in all matters. My wisdom, the wisdom that understands both your peoples, will guide us. This peace will be built on respect. It will be built on the shared love for this child, and it will be built on the truth that now exists between the three of us." The silence that followed was absolute. She had asked them to dismantle their world, to relinquish their solitary authority, to trust not just each other, but her, completely. It was a concept as foreign and terrifying as peace itself had once been. Kael was the first to move. He looked at Lorcan, not with hatred, but with the grim acknowledgement of a fellow general who knows a battle cannot be won by traditional means. He then looked at Elara, and in his eyes, she saw the ice finally melt, revealing not just respect, but a profound, humbled admiration. He gave a single, slow nod. Lorcan let out a long, ragged breath. He looked at the woman who had saved his life, who had challenged his every assumption, who had just laid a future at their feet more daring than any battle plan. A slow, genuine smile, devoid of its former sharpness, spread across his face. It was a smile of surrender, not to an enemy, but to a hope greater than his pride. "A true union," he murmured. Elara extended her hands, not in supplication, but in invitation. A bridge between two worlds, after a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity. Kael's strong, elegant hand closed around her right one. Lorcan's rugged, scarred hand enveloped her left. Their grip was not possessive. It was an anchor, a pledge. They stood there, the three of them connected. The war was over, not just the war of territory, but the war of old ideas. The path forward would be complex, fraught with challenge, and utterly unprecedented. But as Elara stood between them, her hands held in theirs, she felt not like a rope in a tug of war, but the strong, central pillar upon which they could both lean. She was no longer a tool used to make peace. She was the peace itself, the end.